Hi, I'm Nikki Jovicic from LookUpStrata, and I'm here today with Chris Irons from Strata Solve. We're trying something a little different. We call these our micro webinars, and we've been covering a few different topics in this series. These videos are shorter than our usual webinars, so CPD points don't apply. Instead, this is a short, sharp grab of content about an essential issue. This series is great for the time poor among us, but we are still giving an expert strata perspective. Chris is well known from his time as Queensland's former Body Corporate Commissioner, and he's now out on his own as an independent strata consultant. This session is particularly dealing with nuisance. Chris, over to you.
Thanks very much, Nikki. Hello, everybody. As Nikki said, micro webinars are all about short and sharp, so let's rip straight into it today. Today, what a nuisance, body corporate nuisance issues. A disclaimer that this isn't legal advice today, it's more a perspective, and all references to legislation here are references to Queensland legislation unless otherwise stated, but the issues have applicability across Australia, we think. Nuisance. It comes up a lot, but what does it actually mean in a strata context? Well, we're going to try and break that down very quickly in this micro webinar. In Queensland, there is a reference to nuisance under the Body Corporate and Community Management Act, but it's not really defined. It is contextualised though, in the context there, it must be nuisance in relation to the use of a lot or common property, and those are very important distinctions. While we don't have a definition, we do have case law that has set a benchmark for what is considered a nuisance. So what do we mean then? So Body Corporate and Community Management Act, Section 167. A nuisance can be a visual nuisance as well as a more traditional meaning. And by that, a nuisance can actually be something obscuring a view, for example, causing a nuisance, or it can be a reflection off a surface causing a visual nuisance, as well as the more traditional meanings. As we said, it must be connected to use of a lot or a common property. In terms of the how, there is it needs to be tangible, it needs to be verifiable, and then needs to have the impacts able to be measured. That's how you tend towards assessing whether or not something is a nuisance and whether it can therefore be pursued. And the thought bubble that I'd like everyone to think about there, number one, in Queensland, smoking as a nuisance has absolutely been defined by the courts. There is a very well-known case in Queensland which has defined what constitutes a nuisance for the purpose of smoking. The hot button nuisance issues then, it is pretty tough to establish the threshold for nuisance under the Queensland provision, and I dare say it's the same in other states and territories too. It can be a very, very lengthy process to follow it through. And as I said, there's limited application. So if it doesn't happen in relation to a lot or common property, there's not really any option to pursue it. And our next thought bubble. Nuisance might actually be a different legislative provisions. For example, in Queensland, there are provisions about interfering with utility infrastructure. So what one of us might think of as nuisance might actually be something else, or it might actually be a bylaw enforcement issue. What are my best practice tips when it comes to nuisance then? Unsurprisingly, communication is key. Being clear, concise, and transparent about what the problem is and the impact it is having. Even though legislation does provide for nuisances as number two, proceedings are not always going to be the answer. There may well be alternatives to formal proceedings to get outcomes when nuisance is occurring. Number three, try and address cause rather than effect. Easier said than done, but I think that that's actually the answer to getting some longer term harmony. And our final micro webinar thought bubble for nuisance. Are your bylaws clear and practical enough to manage nuisances when they arise? In my experience, in a lot of cases, they're not. That's it for our micro webinar on nuisance. If you have more questions, and no doubt you will, there's some contact details up there. Thanks very much. Nikki, back to you.
So if you're experiencing nuisance problems in your scheme, place a comment below this video and we'll do our best to provide a response. I'll point you in the right direction. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks very much, Nikki. Thanks, everyone.